Welcome to the discussion of psychoanalytic theory, Freud and Jung. Disclaimer: this lecture involves discussion of sexual organs. Let's just get one thing out of the way. In talking about psychoanalytic theory, we need to be comfortable with discussing genitalia. So, let's practice. It's okay if you want to whisper, but you've got at least to say the words to get started. Ready? Go! Penis! Vagina! Phew! I'm glad that's over. How'd we do? Pat yourself on the back if you lived through that experience. I think our modesty about discussing sexual issues publicly arises as a kind of residue left over from the 19th century, when people were modest, even prudish, and had delicacy, to use Jung's critique of Freud. They couldn't refer to the stomach when discussing stomach aches. Even today, the reluctance exists in more formal conversations surrounding use of the appropriate terminology. Maybe my problem is repression. The cultural norm is to avoid such topics in polite company, so I readily repress the need. Well, for the space of 10 minutes, we'll indulge. Psychoanalysis has three meanings: psychological theory, application of that theory to patients, and application of that theory in other disciplines like literature. The theory was developed by Sigmund Freud at the very end of the 19th century in Europe in the context of other psychologists using the talking cure method. He made hypotheses and tested them while observing patients. The main concepts we'll need to have in mind while applying psychoanalytic theory to literature relate to personality and to the development of sexuality. In Freudian psychoanalytic theory, the personality is comprised of the ego, id, and superego. These terms don't originally come from Freud. The ego organizes experience, controls the id and superego, and interacts with the external world. We can understand it as executive control. Freud used the term ich, meaning I, so perhaps in the attribution of the word ego for ich arises the idea of egoism? The id is the instinct, often the release of energy or tension. Freud used the word es, or it, which suggests a separation between self and instinct. The superego is comprised of prohibitions, parental beliefs, and moral codes. These are values internalized from living in the world. Freud used the term Über-Ich, or over-I, which suggests an external force governing personality. While there are moments when the id or superego has control, the personality usually operates with the ego controlling the other two, and aspects of the other two may be repressed in order for the individual to live normally. The unconscious is comprised of repressed aspects of the personality, and it is larger than the conscious aspects. One might equate the conscious to the tip of the iceberg, and the unconscious as the huge chunk of ice below the surface, and the waterline as the repression barrier separating the two. Repression is normal and healthy, but when the wrong aspects of personality get repressed, or when the repressed issues cross the repression barrier into conscious life in difficult ways, the task of psychoanalysis is to bring aspects of the unconscious to light in order to reduce neurosis, or the disorder resulting from repressed issues. In addition to personality, we should also review Freud's stages in the development of sexuality. According to Freudian theory, there are three erogenous zones: the mouth, the anus, and the genital organs. These zones correspond to three stages in sexual development: the oral, anal, and phallic or sexual phase. In the oral phase, during a child's first year of life, the child focuses on oral pleasure. The mouth is the site where the child interacts with the world. The child nurses at the breast, sucks on pacifiers, and chews on teething rings. Initially, the child has no concept of the external and does not immediately experience him or herself as separate from the mother. At 3 months, the child begins to distinguish inner and outer stimuli. Through these object relations and the anxiety caused by them, from the objects disappearing and reappearing, the peekaboo or fort da game, the child learns to respond to anxiety, control himself, and organize experience. As a defense mechanism, he or she might project negative feelings onto other things and people. He or she might also use a transitional object to get used to the separation between self and other. In the anal phase during the second year, the child experiences pleasure in relief from elimination. Okay, let's be a little more accurate, from pooping, a favorite word of my daughter, who may still be stuck in the anal phase at 8 years old, with everyone who sculpts with clay and likes the bathroom scene from Dumb and Dumber. At this point, the child begins to separate from the mother, which will seem dangerous. In the phallic or sexual phase during and after the third year, boys experience the Oedipus complex and girls the Electra complex, Jung's term for concepts originating in Freud. The latter was basically an afterthought for Freud, who focused more on the masculine developmental model. During this period, the child learns to separate him or herself from others. In the masculine model, the boy begins the phallic period loving his mother and identifying with his father. When the sexual urge increases, the boy's love for his mother becomes more incestuous, and as a result he becomes jealous of his rival, the father. If he persists in feeling sexually attracted to the mother, he runs the risk of being physically harmed by the father. This fear is called castration anxiety, and it arises partly from seeing that girls lack penises. This anxiety enables the boy to repress his inappropriate feelings, eliminating the Oedipus complex. The Electra complex occurs when girls recognize their lack of a penis envy. This desire for a penis helps separate girls from their mothers. Eventually, desire for a baby replaces penis envy, and the father becomes a love object. Because her mother is a competitor for the love of her father, the girl fears her mother. Like boys, girls learn to repress their feelings and seek heterosexual relationships outside the family. Freud's work is important in terms of its significant influence on the field of psychology. It's also important in the comparison Freud makes in Interpretation of Dreams between dreams and literature as arising from, and therefore revealing, the unconscious. Based on this assumption, psychoanalytic theory can be applied to authors, as Freud does regarding the biographical sources of Shakespeare's Hamlet, to fictional characters, as Freud does with Oedipus and Hamlet, and also to readers, although the psychoanalytic theorists will be looking at focus primarily on the author's creative experience. The connection is additionally important in terms of the way both dreams and poetry jam fragments of ideas together without logical connection, providing fodder for interpretation. As you might imagine, there are a number of problems with Freud's developmental model. Freud's model is penis-focused, assuming males possess a valuable appendage that is viewed and experienced as a lack in females. This focus on the penis defines the male as the norm and the female as the other. Freud's model assumes a heterosexual norm, which implies other varieties of sexual development are abnormal. Freud's model is dominated by sexuality as the defining feature of development, to the exclusion of other developmental issues. As noted earlier, smackdown, Freud's former student Carl Gustav Jung takes Freud to task for reducing everything to sexuality. In particular, Jung rejected Freud's equation between dreams and art as objects of interpretation, arguing that art is not neurosis. Jung argued for a limited role of psychology in aesthetics, indicating psychological exploration was appropriate only to examine the process of artistic creation, and not to define artistic technique or quality. In addressing artistic production, Jung argues that some production is introverted, controlled consciously by the artist, while other production is extroverted, where the artist is dominated by the material or has been taken captive by his work. The distinction may relate to Nietzsche's distinction between the Apolline and Dionysic in art, as well as to Wordsworth's spontaneous overflow of powerful emotion recollected in tranquility. It may also connect to Elizabeth Gilbert's TED Talk, advocating for imagining genius as something outside the artist that visits temporarily, like a thunderstorm across the fields, or like Dobby the house elf. Jung also argues that art is an autonomous complex that moves from the unconscious across the repression barrier into the conscious. The source of art may be the personal unconscious of the individual, or the collective unconscious of the human race, repressed throughout history and resulting in artistic resemblances, archetypes, shared across time and place. The common situation of creativity in the unconscious among psychoanalytic theorists is particularly important to contemporary views of the creative process.